Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Since we're so close to the 4th of July, I thought that while I was doing one of my speed builds, I would talk about some very influential people throughout American history. And while I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to show you my red, white, and blue speed build. Now this house actually, I googled American house, and this was the house, albeit not in that color, but this is the house that popped up in Google. So you can watch me make this house while I talk about some influential Americans throughout the years. Let's get started. So you've probably read about Sacagawea or heard about her throughout elementary school or maybe even high school, but you probably don't know the entire story. Sacagawea was born circa 1788 and was the daughter of a Shoshone chief. Her name actually means bird woman or boat puller. Now, she is best known as a Shoshone interpreter working with Lewis and Clark for their expedition into the American West. But what you probably didn't know is that she did this at a very young age. So around the age of 12, Sacagawea was captured by a rival tribe and was sold to a French-Canadian trapper who made her his wife. And she later became pregnant with his son. In November of 1804, an expedition led by Lewis and Clark entered the area in which her and her husband lived. Lewis and Clark met with her husband and hired him to serve as an interpreter on their expedition. And then even though she was pregnant with her first child, Sacagawea was chosen to accompany them on their mission. Lewis and Clark believed that her knowledge of the Shoshone language would help them later in their journey. They also believed that traveling with a woman would help them because it would make them seem more peaceful. In February of 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to a son. And despite traveling with a newborn during the long trek, she proved to be helpful in many ways. She was very skilled at finding edible plants, and when their boat capsized, she was able to save some of its cargo, including important documents and supplies. And it was through her that the expedition was able to buy horses from the Shoshone to cross the Rocky Mountains. After reaching the Pacific coast in November 1805, Sacagawea was allowed to cast her vote along with other members of the expedition for where they would build a fort to stay for the winter. Sacagawea, her husband, and her son remained with the expedition on the return trip east until they reached the Mandan villages. Not much is known about Sacagawea after she left the expedition. We know that Sacagawea gave birth to her second child, a daughter, and that she died a few months later in 1812. Though we don't know a whole lot about her, what's undeniable is that she was a remarkable girl and young woman. She was an invaluable asset for Lewis and Clark and their expedition, and she did everything while carrying a baby on her back. Let's talk about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born around 1820 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Harriet had 8 brothers and sisters, but the realities of slavery eventually forced many of them apart, despite Harriet's mother's attempts to keep the family together. When Harriet was 5 years old, she was rented out as a nursemaid, where she was often whipped when the baby cried, leaving her with permanent emotional and physical scars. Harriet's desire for justice became apparent at age 12 when she spotted an overseer about to throw a heavy weight at a fugitive slave. Harriet stepped between the slave and the overseer, and the weight struck her head. Later, she talked about the incident, and she said, "The weight broke my skull. They carried me to the house all bleeding and fainting. I had no bed, no place to lie down on at all, and they laid me on the seat of the loom, and I stayed there all day and the next." The injury left Harriet with headaches and narcolepsy. She had vivid dreams which she believed were visions from God. Around 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free black man, and changed her last name from Ross to Tubman. The marriage wasn't great, and John threatened to sell Harriet further south. Because of her husband's threat and the knowledge that 2 of her brothers, Ben and Henry, were about to be sold, provoked Harriet to plan an escape. On September 17, 1849, Harriet and her brothers escaped their Maryland plantation. The brothers, however, changed their minds and went back. But with the help of the Underground Railroad, Harriet persevered and traveled 90 miles north to Pennsylvania and freedom. Tubman wasn't satisfied living free on her own. She wanted freedom for her loved ones and friends as well. She returned to the South to lead her niece and her niece's children to Philadelphia via the Underground Railroad. In 1850, Fugitive Slave Act allowed fugitive and freed slaves in the North to be captured and enslaved. This made Harriet's job as an Underground Railroad conductor much more difficult, and it forced her to lead enslaved people to Canada. They traveled at night, usually in the spring or fall when the days were shorter. It's believed that over the years, Harriet personally led at least 70 enslaved people to freedom, including her elderly parents, and she instructed dozens of others on how to escape on their own. She claimed, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Harriet was recruited to assist fugitive enslaved people at Fort Monroe and worked as a nurse, cook, and laundress. In 1863, Harriet became head of an espionage and scout network for the Union Army. She provided crucial intelligence to Union commanders about Confederate Army supply routes and troops and helped liberate enslaved people to form Black Union regiments. After the Civil War, Harriet settled in New York. She married former enslaved man and Civil War veteran Nelson Davies in 1869, and they adopted a little girl named Gertie a few years later. Harriet continued to care and help for people throughout the years. She toured parts of the Northeast, speaking on behalf of the women's suffrage movement, and actually worked with noted suffrage leader Susan B. Anthony. She passed away on March 10, 1913, from pneumonia. Harriet Tubman was an incredible woman and an American hero. I'm sure you've heard of Rosa Parks, but you may not have heard of Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin is a civil rights activist who, before Rosa Parks, refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. Colvin was born on September 5, 1939, in Montgomery, Alabama. She studied hard in school, she earned mostly A's in her classes, and aspired to become president someday. On March 2, 1955, Colvin was riding home on a city bus after school when a bus driver told her to give up her seat to a white passenger. She refused, saying, "It's my constitutional right to sit here as much as that lady. I paid my fare. It's my constitutional right." Colvin felt compelled to stand her ground. After her refusal to give up her seat, Colvin was arrested on several charges, including violating the city's segregation laws. For several hours, she sat in jail, completely terrified. She said, "I was really afraid because you just didn't know what white people might do at that time." After her minister paid her bail, she went home where she and her family stayed up all night out of concern for possible retaliation. In court, Colvin opposed the segregation law by declaring herself not guilty. The court, however, ruled against her and put her on probation. Despite her personal challenges, Colvin became one of the 4 plaintiffs in the Browder v. Gale case. The decision in the 1956 case ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus system was unconstitutional. 2 years later, Colvin moved to New York City, where she lived with her sons and worked as a nurse's aide at a Manhattan nursing home. While her role in the fight to end segregation in Montgomery may not be widely recognized, Colvin helped advance civil rights efforts in the city. Last, let's talk about Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was a pioneer in the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and she was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony was born on February 15, 1820, in Massachusetts. She grew up in a politically active family who worked to end slavery as part of the abolitionist movement. The Anthonys were also part of the temperance movement, which attempted to cease the production and sale of alcohol in the United States. When Susan B. Anthony was denied a chance to speak at a temperance convention because of her gender, she was inspired to shift her focus to the fight for women's rights. She realized that no one would take women in politics seriously unless they had the right to vote. She said, "There never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers." She founded the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869 alongside activist Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two created and produced The Revolution, a weekly publication that lobbied for women's rights under the American Equal Rights Association. Its masthead read, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Susan B. Anthony was tireless in her efforts, giving speeches around the country to convince others to support a woman's right to vote. She even took matters into her own hands in 1872 when she voted in the presidential election illegally. She was arrested and tried unsuccessfully to fight the charges, and she ended up being fined $100, which she never paid. Susan B. Anthony never married, and she devoted her life to the cause of women's equality. She once said that she wished to live another century and see the fruition of all the work for women. When she died on March 13, 1906, at the age of 86, women still did not have the right to vote. It wasn't until 1920, 14 years after her death, that the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution giving all adult women the right to vote was passed. The 19th Amendment was nicknamed the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in Anthony's honor. In recognition of her dedication and hard work, the U.S. Treasury Department put Anthony's portrait on $1 coins in 1979. Thank you everyone for watching this video today. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to my channel. I put videos out every single week. Thanks guys, have a great day and happy 4th of July.